How will Newcastle's Saudi Arabian takeover affect the Premier League? A 10-minute podcast. Before I get into the video, for cheap good quality football jerseys, retro jerseys and tracksuits, go over to www.jerseyfever.com, a link will be left in the description, and use code ATLANTISFOOTBALL for 5% off. So Saudi Arabia's public investment fund has finally completed the takeover of Newcastle, along with Amanda Staveley and the Reuben brothers. The Saudi-led consortium have reportedly taken over Newcastle in a deal worth £305 million, buying Mike Ashley out in a deal that will see the PFI, the Saudi Public Investment Fund, take 80% of the club, the Reuben brothers take 10%, and PCP Capital Partners, which is Amanda Staveley's investment firm, taking another 10% as well. Now the public reaction is what you would expect. It seems to be along the same lines as the Chelsea and the Manchester City big money takeovers, where people are expecting the injection of money to radically transform Newcastle into one of the top 6 clubs in the Premier League and then on to challenging for the Premier League in the next few seasons. But the landscape is completely different to in 2003 when Roman Abramovich took over Chelsea, and in 2008 when Sheikh Mansour took over Manchester City. In 2003 and 2008 there wasn't the financial fair play that stops clubs spending huge amounts of money out of nowhere that there is currently now. So it's going to be interesting to see how Newcastle will try to get around this, whether they will go for the bold Brask approach of PSG and Manchester City where you just spend and ask questions later, or if they will try to find a way that they can follow the rules but still spend huge amounts of money to completely transform their squad. But it's not just FFP that has changed the landscape. In 2008 and 2003, it really was only the top 2 or 3 clubs in the Premier League, Manchester United, Arsenal, who were the clubs spending these massive sums of money on individual players. However, now we even see clubs like Everton and Aston Villa in the last few seasons spending huge amounts of money both on transfer fees and wages, and yet they still haven't been able to compete with the current top 6 and really haven't got anywhere near the top 4 despite their spending. So in order to transform Newcastle from a club fighting relegation, there is going to have to be a significant amount of money spent, and spent in the right way. Financial analysts have said that Newcastle could probably spend up to £200 million over the next 3 seasons, and this is because of FFP's regulations. The Saudi investment fund is reportedly worth £320 billion, which when compared to Sheikh Mansour's net worth of £20 billion, it seems absolutely absurd, and so it's no surprise that many people think that Newcastle will all of a sudden be out buying the best players, spending money on big wages, but in reality with FFP set up the way it is, the £200 million figure over the next 3 years that I previously mentioned is a much more realistic figure than the billions that Manchester City and Chelsea were able to spend over a 5 to 10 year period. Yes, Newcastle will eventually be spending in the billions the same way as Roman Abramovich and Sheikh Mansour at Manchester City. However, when Manchester City and Chelsea were took over, we saw immediately the massive injection of funds, which in Chelsea's 2003-2004 summer, which was their first season under Roman Abramovich, this figure was £153 million, and that was in the first summer. In Manchester City's first full summer under new ownership in 2009, we saw them spend £130 million on just transfer fees alone. So when you compare the spending of Chelsea and Manchester City in their first summers, the fact that Newcastle are only reportedly able to spend around £200 million over 3 seasons seems wildly inaccurate. However, once you actually look at the FFP details and what clubs actually need to do to abide by these rules, it actually makes a lot of sense, and you can see that the Saudis are going to have a tougher time injecting funds into Newcastle than Sheikh Mansour was able to do with Manchester City and Roman Abramovich was able to do with Chelsea. So FFP rules state that a club can only make a loss of £105 million over the course of a 3-year period. Because Newcastle under Mike Ashley have actually made a profit in the last 3 years of £38 million, this adds to their FFP envelope, allowing them to spend more than they otherwise would be allowed to. Now once you factor in Newcastle's revenue and how they've worked well within FFP regulations in the last few years, Kieran Maguire, who is a financial journalist for football, estimates that Newcastle will be able to spend at least £190 to £200 million over the next 3 years, and that's assuming that the commercial revenue doesn't increase, which of course it will with the Saudis coming in. Newcastle's commercial revenue in 2007 stood at £28 million, and by 2019 it had barely risen, which showed that the club was in stagnation. They hadn't grown with the times, and that's why before this takeover under Mike Ashley, Newcastle were a club falling behind the times, and not just in danger of losing their status as one of the biggest clubs in England, but also losing their place in the Premier League, with them repeatedly fighting relegation throughout how many ever years they've been in the Premier League since they got promoted. And it seems like Newcastle are a fallen giant, so this takeover is going to be the catalyst to completely turn around Newcastle's trajectory. Now, Dr. Rob Wilson, who is a lecturer in sports business management, has said that he does believe that the commercial rights and sponsorship rights will total eventually £100 million a season for Newcastle once the Saudis begin to restructure the club. This is exactly what we saw Manchester City do with the sponsorships of Etihad on their t-shirts and with the stadium as well, so that will bring in significant revenue if Newcastle are able to do a similar thing. We've also seen PSG do a similar thing with Fly Emirates, so even though Newcastle may be restricted by FFP at the moment, in the next few years that will grow as well, and that will expand Newcastle's capabilities. So the mid to long term future of Newcastle is pretty hard to predict at the moment because we don't know how Newcastle will do in the Premier League in this season or even next season, and that will affect dramatically how much they can spend and the players they can attract. But what can we expect from the immediate future? Well, Manchester City, when they got a lot of money in 2008, it was on deadline day, and immediately they made a statement signing Robinho for a then British record fee of around £32 million, I think it was, snatching him away from Chelsea. That transfer obviously didn't pan out how City thought it would, but we do see that these new sides with cash injections do like to make a statement signing at the start. Chelsea in 2003 did this with a few players. They signed one Sebastian Veron from Manchester United, they signed Damien Duff and Hernan Crespo, so those were all statement signings as well. However, for Newcastle the situation is very different. When Roman Abramovich took over Chelsea, they were actually in the top 4 and so were already playing Champions League football, and for the previous decade had performed quite well, not just domestically but also in Europe as well. I think they got to a couple of UEFA Cup finals and I think they won the Cup Winners' Cup before Roman Abramovich came, so they were an established European side. And even Manchester City, the season before Sheikh Mansour took over, had finished 9th, and going into his first real summer transfer window they had finished 10th, so they were at least in the top 10 of the Premier League. Newcastle are fighting relegation, so I would say they're at least a year, but more like 2 years behind Manchester City and at least 3 or 4 years behind Chelsea at least. So we aren't going to see Newcastle all of a sudden become Champions League contenders or Premier League title contenders anytime soon. In the immediate future, in terms of this season, their main focus has to be to stay up. They are currently sitting in 19th place ahead of only Norwich, and they haven't won a game this season. So it does look like not only are they going to have to change manager, but they're going to have to invest significantly in January just to make sure they're a Premier League club next season. I will be making a few videos on this Newcastle situation, firstly looking at their next manager and who I would pick to lead the club forward, the 3 to 5 year strategy I would use at Newcastle, and also a video looking at the January transfers I would look to make, but also suggesting reasons why this is completely different to the Manchester City and Chelsea takeovers, and why Newcastle may need to break this up into a first 2 year period and then a 3 year period after that. So make sure you click the bell and subscribe to the channel so you get notified when those videos come out. But now we'll be going on to the pitfalls and potential mistakes that Newcastle have to avoid, looking back at some prior examples. So with this huge amount of money injected into the club, the big mistake that clubs often make is they prioritise short-term targets that in the long run are just going to cost the club money and set the club's transformation back. I think Manchester City were definitely guilty of this in the early years, signing Robinho. Maybe that wasn't a terrible signing at the time, but just the way it was done seemed a bit erratic, like they didn't really have a plan behind it. In the January transfer window in 2009, they signed Craig Bellamy, Shay Given and Wayne Bridge, which were all strange signings considering they were all 28 or above, and whilst they didn't do bad in the short term, City had to then replace those players within the next few seasons. Chelsea also did similar things with players like Hernan Crespo, Adrian Mutu and one Sebastian Veron, who all needed to be replaced over the next few seasons, and this is why Manchester City and Chelsea both spent huge amounts of money within the first few seasons, because not only were they building a squad, but they were actually replacing players they had already bought, because when they started buying players, they didn't have a clear philosophy, plan or strategy of what they were going to do to build a squad. The first thing Newcastle do before they even start to spend any money is set out a plan and a timeline of what they expect to achieve within the next 3 to 5 years. I will be setting out the strategy and plan that I would use, so I'll come onto that in a later video and go into that in more detail, but Newcastle definitely need at least some sort of structure before they start buying players. But Newcastle also need to avoid falling into the trap of massively overpaying for players, which we have seen Everton do in the last few years, with them spending huge fees on players like Richarlison, Gylfi Sigurdsson, Jordan Pickford, Abdoulaye Doucouré, who are whilst all decent players for a mid-table side, they're not worth the transfer fees that Everton paid, and they could have got a lot better value and got players who had higher potential, and that would have taken Everton's squad to the next level. Instead, Everton are sort of left now with a half-decent squad of players who cost a huge amount of money, and this is why they can't compete with the top 6 or the top 4, because even though they have spent huge amounts of money, the players they've acquired are nowhere near the standard standard needed. But the main thing Newcastle need to avoid is obviously a relegation. If they were to get relegated this season, it would set the whole project back at least 2 or 3 seasons, so avoiding relegation has to be the priority at this very moment. So everything I've talked about I will be coming on to in later videos, which I will hope to release this week and next week, so make sure you subscribe to the channel for that. Give the video a like if you enjoyed this sort of 10-minute podcast, put your thoughts in the comment section below, follow me on Instagram and Twitter for more content as well, and go to the description to check out some of my other videos as well.